So we have a panel today of people who are knowledgeable about Poland, about the election campaign, and I hope also who are possibly going to be tempted to speculate about what's going to happen next. So I hope we'll be able to cover the topic from a variety of different interesting angles. The first person I'd like to introduce is our guest, Alex Szczerbiak, who's Professor of Politics from the University of Sussex, whose expertise covers a lot of areas, but including political parties in Poland and sort of ongoing politics in Poland. I don't know, so would you like, so why they're not coming in? Sean, can you make sure they come? Thank you. And then we have the rest of us are from SSEES. So this is Dr. Paweł Kowski, who is an expert on inequality, particularly in SSEES, socioeconomic inequality, not in SSEES, but in Poland. So he's going to talk a bit more about the economic angle. Dr. Agnieszka Kubal, who is an expert particularly on law and human rights. And although I'm the chair, I'm also going to say a bit because my specialism is migration, which was one of the things which emerged as quite an important topic in the campaign. I don't know how much it influenced people's voting. So I'm Professor Anne White, and I'm Professor of Polish Studies here at SSEES. And the way we're going to organise it is that each of the panellists will speak for about 10 minutes. I'll probably speak for about 5 minutes because I'm only half a panellist. So I'll being half the chair, or fully the chair, but half a panellist. So after we've done that, then there'll be lots of time for discussion. We have 2 hours booked. We could also then extend further up until almost 9 o'clock if people wanted to stay behind for drinks. But the actual sort of intellectual part will be up to 2 hours long. Okay, so but it depends entirely on you, and of course all of our guests who are online, how long it lasts, how many questions you ask, and how many points you want to make. So I don't know, should we start? I suppose we could. So Alex, would you like to go first?
Sure. Right. Thanks very much. It's really nice to be here. The SSEES Polish election roundtable is quite traditional. I think the first one I addressed was 22 years ago, 2001 election. There were lots of questions about who on earth is Andrzej Lepek? What's he all about? And lots of people warning me about this guy called Roman Giertych, who's a fascist and not to be trusted. And he's obviously made a bit of a comeback in this election. So there we go. So I'm going to start by talking about what happened in the election, and then I am going to speculate about what I think is going to happen next. So, I mean, most of you probably know there was an absolutely record turnout for any post-1989 election, 74%, really high. Law and Justice, the incumbent right-wing governing party, won the largest share of votes, about 35%, but fell short of an overall majority, 194, not 231, lead for an overall majority. The 3 opposition parties, Civic Platform, the Third Way Electoral Coalition, and the Left, have enough seats to be able to form a majority government. 248 seats they won between themselves. So that's obviously what happened. This is a bit of a surprise. I mean, some opinion polls were predicting that this would be the outcome, that these parties would emerge with a majority. But most of them weren't. And the real game changer, if you like, and the real big winner of this election was the Third Way. This is this coalition of the very old agrarian Polish Peasant Party, or Polish People's Party as they now try and convince us they're actually called, and a party called Poland 2050, led by Szymon Hołownia, this kind of liberal centrist TV personality who did very well in the 2020 presidential elections. This party got 14% of the vote, when most opinion polls were predicting it will get about 10% of the vote. And this was really important because in this election, there were really 2 important drivers. One was most people were fed up with Law and Justice and wanted change. Okay, they wanted to change the government, but also most people didn't want to go back to the status quo anthem. They didn't want to go back to what they had before the Civic Platform governments, which is why Law and Justice focused its campaign relentlessly on the record of the previous Law and Justice governments and of Donald Tusk. And hence, that's how the referendums, which were obviously a key tactic that proved to be unsuccessful, were all designed around that. And Third Way ended up being a very effective channel for people who wanted change but didn't want to vote for Donald Tusk. They were able to basically convince people that, or enough people, that they were voting for change without going back to the status quo ante. Indeed, they were actually able to switch some law and justice voters over to their side. Very unusual. It's very little crossover between the two camps. So the key game changer in this election was the third way. This proved to be a gateway drug for people who didn't want to vote for law and justice, but also couldn't bring themselves. The other big surprise was the underperformance of the radical right free market. The party that got about 7% of the vote, but it was expecting, or polls were expecting, to get about 10%. And if it had got about 10% of the vote, we would have been in a hung parliament with the Confederation as the kingmaker. That's what most polls were predicting would happen. And therefore, when they underperformed, there was a bit of a surprise there. We talk a lot about that if you're interested. Basically, in the long and the short of it was Confederation peaked too early. Okay, they withered when they started to come under media pressure and scrutiny and had no idea on how to build on their early success. Okay, so what happens next? Constitutionally, the next move is with the president, the law and justice backed president, Andrzej Duda. He's got to convene a parliament within 30 days, so that's November. He then has the first attempt at nominating the prime minister, okay, and he has 14 days to do that, and then whoever he nominates has 14 days to get a vote of confidence in second development. Andrzej Duda, before the election, made it clear that he would nominate, he would offer the largest party in parliament. There's any reason to think he won't do that. So if you do the arithmetic, and you obviously assume that's going to be law and justice, and you assume they're not going to get a majority, which is a good assumption, that kind of takes you to the middle of December, okay, at which point it then passes into the hands of Parliament. Parliament has 14 days to form a government, for a government to get voted. So that's obviously what's going to happen. So the current situation is probably going to last until about the middle of December. When this new government is sworn in, it will not face an easy situation, especially in terms of trying to get its legislative programme through. Firstly, it's very ideologically heterogeneous. It ranges from social conservatives, fiscal conservatives, through to liberals and radical leftists. I mean, there are serious differences on both socio-economic policy and on moral cultural issues like abortion. The only thing that really unites them and is bringing them together is they don't like law and justice. Okay, that's the one thing that absolutely does unite them, and they want it. But beyond that, it's going to be difficult for them to agree a coherent government program. The second problem is, although they have a majority, they don't have a 60% majority, 276 seats. And you need that to overturn a presidential veto. The president, of course, is Andrzej Duda, backed by Law and Justice, until 2025. So their legislation could potentially, any of it, be struck down by the election. Thirdly, the third problem, the Constitutional Tribunal, a very powerful body that can review and strike down all Polish laws if it doesn't feel that they're compatible or in line with the Polish constitution, comprises 15 members who are elected by Parliament. Every single one of the current members of the Constitutional Tribunal was appointed by Parliament since Law and Justice. So that even if they can get through all these other stages, potentially the Constitutional Tribunal can start their legislation. One option that Andrzej Duda has is to refer legislation to the Constitutional Tribunal, which doesn't come into effect until the Constitutional Tribunal has ruled. So for all those reasons, the main focus, I think, of the initial actions of the government is going to be on personnel, public appointments, and elite turnover. In other words, there's a number of reasons for this, partly because it's difficult to get legislation through, partly because it's something you can easily get the parties to agree on. It's much easier to get parties to agree on patronage rather than it is on policies. You know, everybody wants a share of the spoils. So what you'll see is a big turnover in public administration, in the civil service, in state-owned companies, in government supervisory bodies, and in the diplomatic corps. Ambassadors will be cleared out. What will be more problematic for the incoming government will be positions that are constitutionally protected, okay, or have fixed terms which are constitutionally protected, or which require legislation to remove. So members of the Constitutional Tribunal, for example, or the National Bank of Poland, the Monetary Committee, which decides Poland's monetary policy, and the governor of the National Bank of Poland, protected. Judges. There are 2,000 judges that have been appointed, large numbers of Supreme Court judges, which the opposition argue are illegitimate, neo-judges they call them, are constitutionally protected. It's difficult. You can't just sack a judge. It's very, very difficult. State TV and radio. This one will be really interesting, okay? Because I think, or I always assumed, that you need legislation. You basically need to, it's a body called the National Media Council that appoints state TV and legislation. And in order to get rid of the National Media Council, which has a fixed term, you'll need legislation. The opposition seems to think you can do this through, there's a get around it. You can use the fact it's a state-owned company, okay, with wholly owned by the Treasury and just declare it bankrupt. Now, that's one of the options that they've said. But if there's legislation required to get rid of state-owned TV, the management of state-owned TV, that's going to be very problematic because, of course, Andrzej Duda will veto the legislation, or could veto the legislation, or refer it to the Constitutional Tribunal. And the opposition are desperate to change the management of Polish television because they believe it is a law and justice propaganda channel. Okay. One area where there is consensus among the parties is foreign policy. And here, the biggest change that we're likely to see is in terms of relations with the EU. The incoming government will halt attempts by Law and Justice to try and build alternative power blocks within the EU as a counterweight to the Franco-German axis. It will instead try and build closer relations with the EU political establishment, especially Berlin. And, use a kind of metaphor, they will try and relocate Poland within the so-called European mainstream, not try and carve out its own stream, which was the policy of the Law and Justice government. And they will also try and repair relations with Brussels over rule of law. Beyond that, it's actually very difficult to know what this government will do, okay? Because it's really just talked in kind of generalities about returning to Europe and rebuilding links with the EU institutions and whatever, and has really avoided talking about specifics. So I have no idea what they will do about climate policy. I have no idea what they'll do about migration policy. I have no idea what their stance is on the reforms being proposed by Germany to remove the veto in areas certain areas like foreign policy, finance. We didn't get any clue from that during the election campaign. The parties avoided talking about this. We didn't get much of a clue from it from Law and Justice because they didn't talk about it much either, except about migration. But they've got 8 years in government before them, so we know more or less what they think about most of these issues. The one specific, okay, that we can definitely expect some movement on is an attempt to unlock the coronavirus recovery fund money, which is being withheld by the European Commission because it argues that the disciplinary system of the Supreme Court in Poland violates the rule of law. Now, Donald Tusk should have been in Brussels on Monday, because he promised the day after the election he would fly to Brussels and sort this out, because that's already one of the election pledges he's broken. Seriously, there are actually milestones that have to be met in order for that funding to be released. Okay. And the assumption is that those milestones need legislation. But what if Andrzej Duda vetoes that legislation or refers it to the Constitutional Tribunal? Now, of course, the Commission could just unlock that fund as a political goodwill gesture. They could just say, yes, look, we've got a government that's clearly committed to the rule of law. Let's give them with the benefits of that. But if they do that, that plays straight into Law and Justice's narrative, which says this has nothing to do with the rule of law. It's politically motivated. It's because they don't like us as a government, and they do like the new government, and therefore they. Okay, just quickly to finish, what's coming up in Poland that we need to look at over the next 18 months? There are two sets of local elections. There's local elections in the spring, there's European Parliament elections in the summer. The government will do quite well in those. Okay, governing parties in the first year that they're in office enjoy a honeymoon. They tend to do quite well in what's called second order elections. Okay. Much more important is the presidential election, which is taking place in the summer of 2025. And as you can see from what I just said, that is going to be absolutely critical in terms of the future trajectory of Polish politics, and specifically what's going to happen in the second term for this. There was a lot of talk about, how this election was the most important until 1989. Maybe it was, but now the most important election since 1989 is the summer 2025 presidential.
Thank you so much, Anna, for having me. And I'm quite happy to talk after Alex, because there are a few things I want to sort of take forward. So I want to talk from the perspective. I agree. We don't have yet, but we might have a traffic light coalition that will probably start a form government in before Christmas, given the obstructions of the President Duda, who already said that he is quite likely to follow the good tradition of giving the role to form the government to the winning party. I mean, that wasn't always the case in the Polish politics. I think in 1996, when the former post-communist, the SLD, did very well, but they did not have majority, the then president, Aleksander Kwaśniewski, gave the function to form the government to the coalition of Akcja Wyborcza Solidarność and Unia Wolności. And asked for the government to be formed with the Prime Minister of Jerzy Buzek. So there is a precedent in the past that President Duda could draw on had he had a little bit more of goodwill, maybe. But so Anne introduced me as the sort of I'm interested in the social-legal situation in Poland, particularly in the context of the crisis of the rule of law that we have experienced over the last 8 years, but particularly from 2015, when Law and Justice took power. So what needs to be done in order to remedy the situation we are in at the moment? And there are, I think, 3 steps. The first of them is the politically easiest and quite most expedient to be done. The other 2 are much more complicated, and I agree here with Alex that they will depend a lot on the goodwill of the president or the president's right to veto, how often he will use that, and of course on the tribunal, on the role of the courts. So the first thing that is the easiest to do to remedy the crisis we are in is to decouple the roles of the Prosecutor General and Minister of Justice. At the moment, these 2 quite important functions in the state were accumulated in the one person who was steering the justice system in Poland single-handedly, and that is Zbigniew Ziobro. He was both the Prosecutor General and Minister of Justice. These 2 roles need to be separate, and there needs to be a checks and balances in place to introduce fundamental changes to the prosecutor's office. So that's the easiest to do. That just requires, I think, political will on the coalition government. The 2 next steps are, I think, are much more difficult. The first would be to solve the legal dualism that we have in Poland at the moment. The legal dualism meaning that we have 2 sets of judges. The judges that result from the nomination of the reformed, or some would say deformed, Council of National Council of Judiciary, the KRS, Krajowa Rada Sądownictwa, and the judges that use that nomination and take part in those promotion procedures, etc., and therefore they create a sort of a dual system where you have the judges that are legitimate and the new judges, which, as we know by the rulings of the European Court of Justice, but also the European Court of Human Rights, they have not received their nomination in a process that was fair and accepted in a democratic society. As we have heard this morning, the President Duda just nominated 72 new judges, resulting from the nomination of the National Judicial Council. So, as you can see, it's a very, 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 very fast work, but work that is likely again to thwart any type of reforms. There will be I would say, a backlash in the system, in the current state of affairs, to push against solving that legal dualism. And the third, I think, is the situation of the Constitutional Tribunal. It still has 3 judges in it. So aside from the 15 judges, all of them have been nominated by Law and Justice, and 3 of them are the so-called double judges, or judges that were elected in place where there were no basically places on the bench anymore. There were judges that were already elected, but then when Law and Justice came to power, they sort of re-elected these 3 judges. And we are talking about Mariusz Muszyński, Justyn Piskorski, and Jarosław Wyrembak, the three judges who are doubling the places already on the bench. And as the European Court of Human Rights has said, this is as a result, the Constitutional Tribunal is not a court according to the law in the famous case of Seroflor in 2021. So there needs to be at least partial remedy to the situation. How to do it? How to do it is much more, I think, difficult question. So in terms of removing the legal dualism and the sort of different judges at the different levels of the Polish justice system, we have a bill, or I would say a draft of a bill that was produced by Justitia, which is a judicial association, and that bill has been introduced with input from various experts, legal experts, both in Poland and international experts, civil society, and legal NGOs. And then, as far as the Constitutional Tribunal situation, there we can go 2 ways. First would be to at least remove the judges that have been elected when there were no places on the bench. So to elect to remove the double judges and introduce some form of legality back to the working of the Constitutional Tribunal. The second move is, I think, much more radical, given the type of marginalization that the Constitutional Tribunal has suffered over the last couple of years. I mean, let me remind the esteemed audience the fact that before 2015, the Constitutional Tribunal was quite a court that was attracting quite a lot of, I would say, respect and esteem among not only lawyers in Poland, but also academics and legal experts. Now the court has been marginalized in the sense that, for instance, the lawyers from the Office of the Civil Rights Ombudsman are not directing any new petitions to the court, because what the court will say might not necessarily have any legal significance, because this is not a court. according to the law. So the court has been quite marginalized. So the more radical situation or more the radical solution would be to come up with a new bill that would a new bill around the Constitutional Tribunal. We have a draft ready that was prepared by the Batory Foundation. The draft has been published in 2022, so it's a new draft. Again, it has been positively assessed by many legal experts and constitutional lawyers in Poland. That bill would, for instance, remove the single-handed presidency of the court and introduce a more collegiate way in which the court is governed. It will also include a new ways in which the judges are being elected. So it's not so as to prevent a subsequent politicization of the court, but ensure its greater independence of the parliament. But again, passing that law would require a goodwill of the president. And we cannot expect the goodwill of the Constitutional Tribunal, which would need to sort of basically do its own homework, so judge a case in its own. So these are sort of the scenarios that are likely to be quite tricky. But I think the last thing I want to say, apart from these three changes, the last change is about the Polish judges. The Polish judges, regardless whether they are the legitimate ones or the ones that have been elected in the procedure of the new politicized National Council for Judiciary. The civil society gave the judges a huge credit of trust. The type of marches and rallies that the independent justice system have received from the society, the type of support either during the disciplinary proceedings of individual judges, like Judge Żurek or Judge Tuleja or Judge Juszczyszyn, the type of public support these judges received means that the courts cannot go back to a situation before 2015, in the sense that the courts are insulated from the society, and the only way the judges communicate with the society is through their judgment. So the judges are the mouthpieces of the law, or they perceive themselves as in the ivory tower and communicating with the society only through their judgments. I think the relationship with the broader society needs to be the court needs to be much more open. And I think the relationship with the broader society, with the broader civil society, needs to be really rethought by the judges as the professional group, given the support they've received during that difficult time from the civil society.
Thank you very much. So, Pavel, would you like to go next?
Thanks a lot for coming, and it's a privilege to talk about after Agnieszka and Alex. So maybe repeat some of the thoughts, but maybe put them in a bit different light of economic policies in the next few years. And I will kind of first talk a little bit about what I expect will happen in the next few years, kind of short run thinking about Polish economy and policies. But then at the end we'll say a little bit more what I think about the long run implications of all this change, which I think might be very substantial. So just to set the stage, as Alex mentioned, this new coalition is quite diverse when it comes to economic policies. On the one hand, it can be something which does not provide stability. On the other hand, it could be actually advantage, in the sense that they could temper each other. So neither very extreme left-wing or very extreme right-wing policies can go through, because both sides will kind of try to counterbalance each other. And it's kind of, but there are actually a lot of commonalities between those parties, especially when we kind of what we observed in the election campaign. So all of these parties kind of promised a massive increase in a budget deficit, but it's not just the three of them. Actually, all of the parties. In fact, the Konfederacja, which is the neoliberal economic parties, suggested. Their program would imply second largest increase in the budget deficit for modern parties considered, more than PiS or PO. Now, interesting thing, and here I'm talking about like increase in deficit, which would be around 1/3 of the current Polish budget. So just really unsustainable increase in public spending. Now, the parties, however, differ in how they want to achieve this increase in deficit. So on the left side, it's mostly for increase in public spending. On the other hand, we have the third way, which is mostly through tax cuts, and kind of the civic platform is kind of combining these two things together. Now, besides this, so there's quite a substantial difference in what they actually want to do in terms of boosting the kind of worsening the budget in some sense. Now, there are some common major things. I think that I kind of managed to find the three of them. So first is neither of the parties want to cut the social benefits. I don't think this is not the same, especially talking about civic platform. It's not the same party as it was 2010, where kind of austerity was in fashion and this is what you would do. Here, we kind of what we earn also from this country's austerity is something which is rather the structures for the countries. So I don't think there will be any appetite from neither of the parties to actually cut, let's say, from 100 plus the famous flagship child allowance program, or to say somehow reduce spending on education and so forth. Second thing is already what Alex mentioned. I think there will be, of course, all of the parties want to unfreeze the EU recovery funds. So that will provide a quite big boost to the Polish budget, to the kind of spending in Poland. It's roughly estimated to be 1/4 of the current Polish budget. So it's a quite substantial amount of money. And the third thing, I think where all these parties agree is to kind of increase spending on public sector employee wages, particularly teachers, nurses, but also a lot of civil servants. So that's kind of, I think, how this looks when it comes to the parties. I mean, they are diverse, but at the same time, I think there's certain kind of common traits. Now, when it comes to external factors, and I think here the next few years, there'll be two main things. So first, as I mentioned, this EU recovery fund, which will be important because it will boost Polish economy. It will provide a lot of investment for especially for like green technologies and digitalization. Now, the kind of unintended consequence of this recovery fund will be, of course, increased demand, and which possibly creates inflationary pressure again. And I know people are fed up with economists saying that inflation will come back, but I'm still kind of pessimistic on this topic, especially that the Glapiński, who is the head of the National Central Bank of Poland, had this shocking cut rates in September, which I think it went down from 6.75 to 5.75, so 1 percentage point decrease in the interest rates in such a short period. Now, usually these things do not have an instantaneous effect on the economy. It usually takes 4 to 5 quarters to actually affect the economy. So I expect this will inflate inflation in Poland, which is still fairly high. It has fallen, but still around 8%. Which, just to give you a reference, the usual target for inflation is 2%. So we are 4 times above the usual target for inflation. Then on the top of this, we also have, oil prices, which now are, because of situation in the Middle East, may again go up. So I think that will be an important context in next year. Like there will be a growing, again, inflationary pressure happening in Poland for all those factors. This is also, forgot to mention in the beginning, we already have a pretty high deficit. So it's around 3.7% of GDP. And so there will be certain, say, reluctance to increase it even more, especially given the inflationary pressure. There will be some help from the EU side, namely the kind of recovery funds. And just to kind of, in terms of overall policy, I think, of course, the civic platform will dominate the economic policies. I think, they will take over the Ministry of Finance for sure. So in a way, probably I would expect civic platform to be the main drive when it comes to economics. And that's why I think because of all these 4 things, the inflationary pressure, already high deficit, and the fact that this will be civic platform mostly steering the economy, I think most of the cases, they will maintain the current status quo when it comes to many policies. I think there'll be low appetite for any significant boost in public spending or like extending certain programs. There'll be also very low appetite for tax cuts. Although Civic Platform promised, the taxable income to be at the level of the UK in nominal terms, which is just simply crazy. I mean, keeping the Polish wages, the nominal value, but having £10,000, 50,600 zloty as a kind of tax credit, it's just also unsustainable in my opinion. Especially that already taxes in Poland are very low. They're much lower than they're actually here. So what I think is, probably what will happen is that, this government will introduce some of the few policies which just are trying to show that they're doing something. Babciowe, so the kind of grandma program, which is trying to basically give some cash transfers to women who are who want to enter the labor market after giving birth. That could be something probably not so massive because these programs are not as expensive as usually people portray them. And I expect that there will be, of course, they will try to boost the wages of public sector employees because it's also the group which wasn't so lucky to vote for them in the elections. So I think this coalition government will try to actually, praise them a little bit more. So I think there will be status quo in the kind of more or less the short run. I don't expect the massive changes in policies. However, I think in the long run, this government could have a big beneficial effect, a big change for the Polish economy. And this is through things like quality of institutions. The fact that central bank had this shocking interest rate cuts last month was because the central bank lost its independence. The Glapiński became basically another politician. And I think, by reconstructing independence central bank, this may have a very positive effect on the Polish economy in the future. Just basically building more trust towards our institutions. But also I noticed, and this kind of comes from my interaction with all the three parties from Lewica, Left, the Third Way, and Civic Platform, they actually cared about good governance. So something I've never experienced from Law and Justice. They actually ask scientists, what do you think about this policy? How would you evaluate this? They're actually interested in these things. So that I think could be also another kind of soft change, which takes years to evolve, but eventually will have a massive change on how policy is being introduced in the country. And finally, and this kind of both when it comes to policies, but also I think when it comes to actually building, when it comes to governance in the public sector companies. And finally, I think what already Alex mentioned earlier is also building stronger ties with the EU, building this cooperation also into economic terms. I don't think the euro will be introduced in the next 4 years in Poland, but we'll have to wait for the next few elections. But overall, general, kind of direction towards the EU will be also beneficial in the long term for the economy.
Thanks very much. Great. So we've nearly finished, but I just wanted to say a few words about migration, since it seemed to be an important topic during the campaign. I could change places. If I sit there, people on Zoom might be able to see me a bit. So just a little bit about migration. So I think there are really three separate things. One is Ukrainians. So there are still just under 1 million Ukrainian refugees in Poland, according to UNHCR. So these refugees, as you probably know, the atmosphere around Ukraine has been souring quite considerably because of the controversy about the grain and the peace government not being support the military effort as it had been in the past, etc. So things have been becoming more problematic for Ukrainian refugees. They've been feeling more unwelcome over the last few months. Now, clearly that's going to change, so that because this new government coming in is perceived to be going to be much more pro-Ukrainian, and therefore that will make the lives of Ukrainian refugees in Poland more more tolerable, as it were, a better atmosphere. But I think there's going to be more than that, because at the moment there's been a problem all the way through ever since Putin's full-scale invasion. There has been a problem with coordinating policy towards Ukrainian refugees. Essentially, the cities took over a lot of the work here, and NGOs and ordinary people. And the national government wasn't really playing a very big role, although obviously Parliament passed the Polish equivalent of the EU directive. So the whole framework is, as it were, set by the EU, and those are set to last until March 2025, as elsewhere in the EU. But nonetheless, the national government wasn't really involved. And up until this election, there's been this problem of a complete mismatch in terms of sort of attention paid to migrants and policy towards migrants. Cities, particularly big cities, being very pro-migrant in various ways and trying to integrate and generally to set up institutions which can incorporate migrants and deal with refugee crises. So that's going to change, presumably. So big cities and the national government will be more or less singing from the same hymn sheet, you would have thought. In terms of the border with Belarus, so this seemed at one point that it was turning into a big campaign issue because of the release in Poland on the 22nd of September of Green Border. So Green Border, all those of us who have seen it, I'm sure, are under a huge impression from this film because it's really, really powerful. It's hard to imagine that anyone could see that film and still feel that pushbacks of refugees on that border were acceptable policy. So it may be that this helps to keep the focus on that particular matter. I do think, though, that it didn't, I mean, the way the government responded to Law and Justice, I think probably didn't have any impact on the outcome. Of course, we can't tell about the outcome of the elections and how much it was influenced. But as you may have read, Rzeczpospolita had a survey where they asked people whether they thought it was going to have an impact. In fact, most people thought that it wouldn't have any impact on the election result. And if they thought it would have an impact, they thought it would actually bolster the opposition vote and not. So it seems like the whole hysteria that came from the Law and Justice government actually didn't help its cause in the end, probably. But in the end, it was probably quite marginal. Still looking forward, I think the fact that this is very much in the public eye could be important. I mean, obviously, since the new government has, well, one supposes different values, and since it's also trying to do things in harmony with the EU, then I think pushbacks, well, I hope, will be a thing of the past. And what will actually happen on that border, presumably, will be determined by the new pact on migration and asylum, which the EU is in the process of seeing through and really wants to get done before the European Parliament elections next year. So it hasn't been actually passed yet by the Parliament, but I mean the European Parliament, but it will be. So when that is finally set up, there will be supposedly better systems for dealing with asylum applications on the borders of the EU. Now, how this will actually work in practice, still unclear, and there's been a lot of criticism actually about the EU's suggestions, and particularly the idea that they're sort of watering down some of the provisions, making certain that people are not returned to countries which are unsafe. So I'm not saying this is going to solve the problem. I think the situation at the moment where you've got border guards pushing people back just to sort of starve and die in the forest, I think that's over. But whether the system that replaces it, the EU system, is going to really help everybody who needs help, I'm very doubtful about that. But at least that it won't be up to the polls themselves to determine, be part of a wider EU policy. I think the other thing I would say about that is that I'm sure that Lukashenko will continue to direct people towards that border because it's in his interest to embarrass the EU, so that the more flow of refugees there is coming over that border, then then the worse it's going to be for the EU. So the problem won't go away in the sense that the people will still be arriving. The third thing, and the thing which I think is the most interesting, but also in some ways was the most I don't know, for me, it was quite a discouraging thing that happened during the election campaign, was about labour migrants. Okay, so if you look at polls of polls up to 2019, I think this was the last time when SEBOS asked people what they thought about labour migration. From 1992 up to 2019, the number of people who were in favour of foreigners being able to freely work in Poland has been going up and up and up. And it was really curious that even after 2015, when there was all that anti-refugee feeling, the majority of polls definitely approved of labour migration. So in a way, they've been sort of protected from the the hostile propaganda and things. And what you have to see this in the context of as well is that in a way, Poland has been just a kind of normal economy in the sense that employers have felt increasingly they needed to depend on migrant labour, and they have been trying to encourage migrants to come and work in Poland, and the Law and Justice government just have let that happen. And that has to be seen in context, again, of the fact that there's been an enormous wave of Ukrainian migration to Poland. So because Ukrainians had a simplified procedure, they didn't need to get work permits to come to Poland. they could come under a different system. So a massive increase of Ukrainian labour migration to Poland, particularly since about 2018. So there are always Ukrainians. So a lot of Ukrainians working in Poland. The economy becomes very dependent in some sectors on its kind of migrant labour rather. Then Ukrainians, to some extent, begin to settle, look for better jobs. When there's a full-scale invasion, males go back to Ukraine, some of the male factory workers, for example. And these two things put together mean that there's been more and more demand for coming from other continents, not from the former Soviet Union, or if from the Soviet Union, from its Asian parts, so from Turkmenistan, from Uzbekistan, and so forth. These people have been coming in a lot, so that by 2022, not including the Ukrainians, there were nearly 300,000 people from other countries who've come through on work permits to Poland. And a lot of these people are working very hard. They're extremely exploited. From my own research, I could tell that as well. So that the agencies who employ them really like them because they're exploitable. So you imagine someone's come from Venezuela. It's really quite easy to exploit someone like that. So it seems to me that there are several things going on here. One is that there is a problem that this has got almost out of hand, that Poland, according to some of my colleagues in Warsaw, by 2019, Poland had more seasonal migrants than even the US. Okay, so it was leading the world in terms of these seasonal migrants. So temporary migrants coming in from countries around the world, not just Ukraine. So this suddenly sort of became noticed by the Polish public and by the political parties during the course of the campaign. I think it's partly also because Orlen, the oil company, much disliked by many Poles. Then one of the things that particularly there was kind of scandal around the fact it was building a whole little town for 6,000 workers from countries around the world in ports, living in containers. So that also somehow sort of people began to notice these people who were secluded away in factories and hadn't been much in the public eye. So they're now in the public eye. So what's going to happen? So during the election campaign, to us, shamefully, in my opinion, took a sort of rather Islamophobic stance and said, the problem is that these people are coming in and, basically they're being let in, they're letting in terrorists and so forth, they're not properly being checked, etc., which was really an exaggeration. And the fact that he singled out Muslim countries particularly was particularly shameful. So like Bangladesh, for example, has quite a large number of these migrants, or as I said, Tajikistan. So there are always things going on. This was connected to a scandal about outsourcing of visa applications and about some corruption in the system of granting visas. But that was, I think, really quite a minor thing. So the problem is not really the system for allocating visas, but the problem potentially is that there are so many people working in Poland who are working in very, very poor conditions, and that employers up to now have had fairly free handing and sort of invited these people in without any kind of proper policy to protect their rights. So again, it'll be very interesting to see what the new government actually does about all this. And there are real problems here about resources. And one of the reasons it's been so difficult to be a migrant in Poland in recent years is the bureaucracy has been really overstretched. And so we don't know if we have a lot of resourcing to actually improving things, making the system better. Thank you.